The fastest way to discover what people truly think of you is to lose the status they believe you have. That lesson hit me the exact moment cold, dirty water poured over my head in front of 400 people. The water soaked my charcoal suit, ran down my sleeves, and dripped onto the polished marble floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Dallas. For a second, the room froze. Then the laughter started. It spread across the ballroom like a wave. Executives laughed. Managers laughed. Employees laughed. Even people who barely knew me laughed because everyone else was doing it. I stood perfectly still beneath the crystal chandeliers while muddy water collected around my shoes. Across from me stood my wife, Natalie Sullivan. Her emerald evening gown sparkled beneath the lights. Her makeup was flawless. Her smile was not. It was the smile of someone who believed she had finally won an argument that had lasted years. Around her stood members of her family. Robert Hayes folded his arms with satisfaction. Brandon Hayes shook his head while grinning. Claire Hayes covered her mouth, trying and failing to hide her amusement. The annual Sullivan Global Leadership Gala was supposed to celebrate another record-breaking year for the company. The ballroom was filled with white tablecloths, gold centerpieces, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline. A live jazz band had been performing only moments earlier. Expensive perfume mixed with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. Everything looked perfect. Then Natalie decided to turn me into the evening's entertainment. "Maybe now people will stop pretending you matter," she said loudly. More laughter followed. I could hear whispers moving through the crowd. "Poor guy? About time." I always wondered why she stayed with him. The comments did not surprise me. What surprised me was how comfortable everyone seemed. As if humiliating someone publicly was completely acceptable when enough people agreed with it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded handkerchief. Slowly, I wiped a drop of dirty water from my cheek. The room began to quiet down. People were waiting for a reaction. They expected anger. They expected embarrassment. They expected me to storm out. Instead, I remained calm. That confused them more than any outburst could have. The truth was simple. I had spent years learning that emotional reactions rarely improve difficult situations. Natalie took a step closer. "Look at him," she said to the crowd. "He still thinks standing there quietly makes him look dignified." Several guests laughed again. I glanced around the ballroom. 400 faces. 400 assumptions. Most of the people in that room believed they knew exactly who I was. They saw an older man who dressed simply. A husband who never talked about business. A quiet figure standing behind a successful wife and her accomplished family. They believed I had achieved very little in life. They believed I depended on Natalie. They believed I contributed nothing. The interesting thing about assumptions is that they only feel accurate until facts arrive. Across the ballroom, near the stage, stood Michael Prescott. As chief executive officer, he was one of the most powerful men in the company. Unlike everyone else in the room, he was not laughing. His face had gone completely pale. He looked from Natalie to me and then back again. Our eyes met. He understood exactly how serious this moment had become. Natalie did not notice. Neither did her family. They were too busy enjoying themselves. The laughter faded completely. Silence settled across the ballroom. Somewhere in the distance, a glass touched a table. The sound seemed unusually loud. Michael remained frozen near the stage. The board members looked confused. Investors exchanged uncertain glances. Something was changing in the room, even if most people did not understand what it was. I folded my handkerchief carefully and returned it to my pocket. Then I looked directly at Michael Prescott. My voice was calm, steady, quiet enough to command attention. "Michael," I said, "it is time." The color drained from several faces before a single person even knew why. 3 hours earlier, the Grand Meridian Ballroom looked nothing like the tense room I was standing in now. Staff members moved between tables, making final adjustments to gold centerpieces. Technicians tested microphones near the stage. The jazz band rehearsed quietly beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Through the enormous windows, the Dallas skyline shimmered in the late afternoon sunlight. Everything appeared polished, successful, and perfectly organized. Most people arriving that evening believed they were attending a celebration. They had no idea they were walking into a lesson. I was not inside the ballroom at that moment. I was reviewing a few documents in a private suite upstairs when my phone vibrated with a message from Michael Prescott. It was brief. He simply confirmed that everything was prepared for the evening. I replied with a single word. Good. Looking back, that exchange feels almost ironic. Neither of us knew how quickly the night would change. Down the hall from the ballroom sat a private executive lounge reserved for senior leadership and their families. Natalie arrived there early with her parents, Robert and Diane Hayes, along with Brandon and Claire. The room overlooked downtown Dallas through floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Leather chairs surrounded a polished conference table. Bottles of sparkling water sat beside trays of catered appetizers. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel important. Unfortunately, some people begin believing the room is proof that they are. The lounge door remained partially open while hotel staff moved equipment through the corridor. Voices traveled farther than anyone inside realized. Brandon was the loudest. He always seemed most comfortable when speaking about someone who was not present. "Tonight is going to be interesting," he said while leaning back in a leather chair. "Maybe Grant will finally realize everybody sees him exactly the way he deserves." Several people laughed. Natalie smiled while adjusting an earring in the reflection of a window. Robert shook his head. "I still cannot understand how a man can spend so many years accomplishing so little and remain comfortable with it." More laughter followed. Nobody challenged the comment. Nobody suggested that perhaps they did not know everything about me. Assumptions are powerful because they allow people to feel informed without requiring evidence. Claire picked up a glass and smiled. "At least he gives us something to talk about at these events." Natalie laughed softly. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just comfortably. That was what made it painful. Genuine disrespect rarely arrives with anger. It arrives with indifference. It arrives when someone stops caring whether their words hurt. Brandon glanced toward a janitorial cart parked near the hallway outside the lounge. A maintenance worker had left it temporarily while setting up equipment elsewhere. On the cart sat a large plastic bucket filled with dirty water from cleaning nearby service areas. Brandon pointed toward it and chuckled. That would definitely wake him up. The room laughed again. What began as a joke lingered longer than it should have. Natalie looked toward the bucket. Robert smiled. Claire covered her mouth while laughing. Nobody said the idea was inappropriate. Nobody suggested treating another person with dignity. Instead, the conversation continued moving in the wrong direction. One joke became another. One comment encouraged the next. By the time they left the lounge and headed toward the ballroom, the atmosphere felt less like a family gathering and more like a group preparing for entertainment. Standing alone in my suite upstairs, I knew none of this. I was adjusting my tie and preparing to attend another company event where I expected very little attention. That had become normal over the years. What I did not realize was that several floors below, people who believed they understood me were making a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. The strange thing is that none of them considered themselves cruel. They believed they were simply having fun. They believed there would be no consequences. They believed the story was already written. They were wrong. Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed. I spent mine learning the value of being overlooked. Looking back now, I understand why so many people misjudged me. The version of Grant Sullivan they saw was carefully incomplete. It was not a lie. It simply was not the whole truth. For years, I drove practical vehicles, wore modest suits, and avoided conversations about money. At company events, I stood near the back of the room instead of the front. I rarely spoke during meetings. I never corrected people when they underestimated me. Eventually, they stopped wondering who I was altogether. That was exactly what I wanted. 3 hours before the gala, while Natalie and her family were sitting in the executive lounge discussing my failures, I was alone in a private suite reviewing quarterly reports. The room overlooked downtown Dallas. Late afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass towers outside. Several thick folders sat neatly arranged on a conference table. Revenue reports, expansion plans, compliance reviews, strategic forecasts. The same types of documents I had quietly reviewed for years. Most people imagine success as a loud thing. They picture television interviews, magazine covers, and social media attention. Real success often looks very different. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting alone in a quiet room making decisions nobody else realizes he is making. My phone buzzed again. Michael Prescott. We spoke only when necessary. That arrangement had worked well for nearly a decade. Michael understood something many executives never learn. Leadership and visibility are not the same thing. A person can be the most important individual in a company without appearing in a single advertisement. I answered the call. Everything is ready, Michael said. Good, I replied. Enjoy the evening. He laughed softly. Something tells me the evening will be memorable. At the time, neither of us fully understood how memorable it would become. After the call ended, I walked toward the window and looked down at the city. Thousands of people moved through their daily routines below. Cars filled the streets. Office buildings glowed beneath the fading Texas sunlight. It reminded me how easy it is to make assumptions about strangers. We see a person for 5 seconds and invent an entire story about their life. Natalie had done the same thing. So had her family. So had almost everyone attending the gala. They believed they knew me because they had observed me. Observation and understanding are not the same thing. Years earlier, Natalie used to ask questions. She was curious then. She wanted to know what motivated me, what I believed, what I hoped to accomplish. Somewhere along the way, the questions stopped. Assumptions replaced curiosity. Once that happens, relationships begin changing in ways people rarely notice until it is too late. The strange part was that I never hid who I was from her. Not really. The clues existed everywhere. My schedule, my travel, my connections, the respect certain executives showed me when nobody was paying attention. Even Michael occasionally slipped and spoke to me differently than he spoke to everyone else. Natalie never questioned any of it. She simply accepted the explanation that felt easiest. Grant was ordinary. Grant lacked ambition. Grant had settled for less. Once people adopt a narrative, they start filtering reality through it. Evidence becomes invisible. That afternoon, I closed the final report and placed it back into its folder. Through the suite door, I could hear distant sounds from the ballroom below. Staff preparing, music testing, glassware being arranged. Everything was moving toward the evening celebration. I adjusted my tie and looked at my reflection in the mirror. Gray suit, calm expression, an unremarkable man approaching his mid-50s. At least that was what most people would see. What they would not see was the weight of 2 decades of decisions. The risks, the sacrifices, the responsibility, the countless lives connected to choices made years before. I left the suite and headed toward the elevator. As the doors closed, I remember thinking the evening would be routine. Another company event, another few hours of polite conversation, another night spent quietly observing from the background. I could not have been more wrong. Because downstairs, people who believed they understood my story were preparing to write an ending that did not belong to them. 22 years before that gala, there was no ballroom, no skyline view, and certainly no company worth celebrating. There was only a rented warehouse on the edge of Fort Worth, a second-hand desk, and an idea that most people considered unrealistic. The roof leaked whenever it rained. During summer, the Texas heat turned the building into an oven. During winter, the concrete floors felt like ice. I remember spending entire weekends inside that warehouse because I could not afford to waste time. While friends took vacations and coworkers enjoyed holidays, I studied contracts, negotiated supply agreements, and searched for customers willing to take a chance on a small, unknown company. The early years were not glamorous. Nobody writes magazine articles about missed payrolls, 18-hour workdays, or sleeping on an office couch because driving home felt inefficient. Yet those years taught me lessons success never could. They taught me patience. They taught me discipline. Most importantly, they taught me that real value is created long before anyone notices it. The first major contract almost did not happen. I spent 3 months preparing a proposal for a regional manufacturing group. Larger competitors had more money, more employees, and more experience. On paper, I had no reason to win. What I had was persistence. I learned every detail of the client's business and offered solutions nobody else considered. When the contract was finally signed, I sat alone in my office staring at the paperwork for nearly 10 minutes. Not because of the money, because it proved the company could survive. 1 contract became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became 50. Over time, warehouses became distribution centers. Small teams became departments. Regional operations expanded into multiple states. Success arrived gradually, then all at once. The strange thing about growth is that every milestone feels temporary. The moment one goal is achieved, another appears. Years passed faster than I expected. Eventually, the company grew beyond anything I imagined when I was standing inside that first warehouse. Investors became interested. Industry publications started calling. Reporters requested interviews. Competitors began paying attention. That was when I made a decision that confused almost everyone around me. Instead of stepping further into the spotlight, I stepped away from it. Most people assumed it was an unusual choice. To me, it felt obvious. Visibility attracts attention. Attention attracts expectations. Expectations create distractions. I wanted freedom more than recognition. So I worked with attorneys, financial advisors, and governance experts to create a structure that would protect the company long after I was gone. Ownership was transferred into carefully designed trusts. Layers of management separated daily operations from ultimate authority. Public records became intentionally quiet. Professional executives handled visibility while I focused on oversight and long-term direction. That structure eventually brought Michael Prescott into the picture. Michael was talented, disciplined, and smart enough to understand the difference between management and ownership. He never confused the two. He respected the system because he understood why it existed. Together we built something designed to endure. Around that same time, another important chapter began. Robert Hayes joined the company. He was hardworking, ambitious, and eager to prove himself. Over the years, Brandon followed. Then Claire. One by one, members of Natalie's family built successful careers inside the organization. I was genuinely happy for them. Promotions arrived. Salaries increased. Opportunities expanded. Watching people improve their lives had always been one of my favorite parts of building a company. What I never anticipated was how quickly success could change perspective. Gratitude slowly became expectation. Opportunity slowly became entitlement. The company transformed from something they appreciated into something they believed would always exist for their benefit. Looking back now, I can see the first signs. Small comments. Casual assumptions. Confidence growing faster than humility. At the time, I ignored it. I believed character would eventually correct itself. I believed people would remember where opportunities came from. Standing in that ballroom years later, water drying on my suit, I realized how wrong that assumption had been. Natalie was not always the woman standing in that ballroom. That is the part people often misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They assume someone wakes up one morning and becomes arrogant, dismissive, or unkind. Real life rarely works that way. Change happens slowly. So slowly that by the time you notice it, years have already passed. When Natalie and I first met, neither of us had much. We rented a small apartment outside Fort Worth. The carpet was worn. The kitchen was tiny. The air conditioner struggled every summer. Yet those years remain some of my favorite memories. We talked about everything. Future plans, dreams, travel, family. Success meant having enough money to pay bills and enough time to enjoy dinner together. Back then, status never entered the conversation. Natalie admired determination. She respected hard work. She believed character mattered more than appearances. That was the woman I married. Somewhere along the journey, things began changing. At first, the changes were almost impossible to see. The company grew. Her family became more successful. New opportunities appeared. Better neighborhoods. Better cars. Better social circles. None of those things were bad on their own. Success should improve life. The problem was not the success. The problem was the way success started reshaping perspective. I remember a dinner party nearly 6 years before the gala. A group of executives gathered at an expensive restaurant overlooking downtown Dallas. The conversation revolved around investments, promotions, and industry recognition. One executive asked what I had been working on recently. Before I could answer, Natalie smiled and said, "Grant likes staying out of serious business discussions." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. At the time, it seemed harmless. Looking back now, I realize it was one of the first moments she stopped seeing me clearly. Similar moments followed. Small comments, casual dismissals, tiny adjustments in how she introduced me to people. I became less of a partner and more of a background detail. At corporate events, she drifted toward executives while I stood alone. At family gatherings, conversations about business happened around me rather than with me. Nobody excluded me intentionally at first. They simply assumed I had nothing valuable to contribute. Natalie never corrected them. The assumptions became normal. Then they became accepted. Then they became truth in everyone's mind. About 4 years before the gala, we attended a charity fundraiser in Dallas. I remember standing near a window while city lights reflected across the glass. A board member approached Natalie and asked how I spent my time. She laughed lightly and said, "Grant has mastered the art of doing as little as possible." The group chuckled. The comment lasted only a few seconds. The memory lasted years. Not because it was cruel, because it was revealing. Respect does not disappear in dramatic moments. It disappears in moments exactly like that. Another memory surfaced often after that. Christmas dinner at Robert and Diane's house. Brandon had recently received a promotion. Everyone celebrated his success. Toward the end of the meal, someone asked what goals I had for the coming year. Before I answered, Brandon smirked and said, his biggest goal is probably finding a comfortable chair. The table erupted with laughter. Natalie laughed too. Not loudly, not maliciously, just naturally, as though the joke made perfect sense. I remember looking across the table at her. She never noticed. That moment taught me something important. People reveal their priorities through what they find funny. By then, Natalie measured success differently than she once had. Visibility mattered. Titles mattered. Recognition mattered. The woman who once admired quiet determination now admired public achievement. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. The very qualities she used to love had become the qualities she respected least. Yet even then, I never imagined the situation would end the way it did. I believed there was still time. I believed people eventually remember what truly matters. Standing beneath those chandeliers years later, surrounded by laughter and assumptions, I finally understood something I should have recognized much earlier. Natalie was not humiliating the man I actually was. She was humiliating the version of me she had created in her own mind. And in only a few minutes, that version was about to disappear forever. By the time the gala officially began, the atmosphere inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom felt almost electric. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Executives mingled beside investors. Department heads greeted clients. Employees posed for photographs beneath banners celebrating another successful year. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. A jazz band played near the stage while waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers and sparkling water. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Inside, something else was happening. The first comment came less than 10 minutes after I entered the ballroom. Brandon spotted me near one of the back tables and walked over with a grin. Grant, he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. I was wondering if you finally decided to do something productive this year. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. Good to see you too, Brandon. He chuckled and shook his head. Always the same answer. Then he walked away feeling victorious. An hour earlier, a comment like that might have bothered me. That evening, it felt different. It felt rehearsed. As the night continued, the pattern became impossible to miss. Robert approached me near the bar and asked whether retirement was treating me well. When I reminded him I had never retired, he laughed and replied that nobody could figure out what else I possibly did. Several guests nearby joined the laughter. Even people who barely knew me seemed comfortable participating. Human beings have a remarkable ability to adopt the opinions of a crowd. Natalie spent most of the evening moving between groups of executives and senior managers. Every time our paths crossed, I noticed the same expression: irritation, embarrassment, disappointment, as though my very presence created a problem she wished would disappear. Around 8 o'clock, Michael Prescott took his place near the stage. The annual leadership presentation would begin soon. Board members gathered near the front. Investors settled into their seats. The room slowly shifted toward a more formal atmosphere. That should have been the end of the evening's distractions. Instead, things escalated. Natalie approached my table carrying a glass of sparkling water. Several members of her family followed behind her. Brandon, Claire, Robert. A small audience formed almost immediately. People sensed entertainment. They always do. Natalie looked down at me and smiled. Everyone keeps asking what you actually contribute around here. The surrounding group laughed. I remained calm. Do they? She nodded. They do. More people turned toward us. Conversations nearby began fading. Attention gathered around our table. Natalie seemed energized by it. You know, she continued, sometimes I think you enjoy letting other people carry the weight while you stand around pretending none of it matters. Brandon laughed loudly. Robert smiled into his drink. Claire looked away, though she did not object. The comments continued, one after another, each one slightly sharper than the last. Years of frustration, assumptions, and resentment poured out in front of an audience eager to watch. Through it all, I said very little. Not because I lacked responses. Because responses would not change anything. People only hear the truth when they are ready for it. Natalie finally threw her hands into the air. "Look at him," she said, not even defending himself. The crowd laughed again. Then her eyes drifted toward the far side of the ballroom. Mine followed. Near a service entrance sat a janitorial cart. A maintenance worker had left it there temporarily while cleaning another area. Resting on the cart was a large bucket filled with dirty water. The moment Natalie noticed it, something changed in her expression. Brandon noticed it too. Their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. The crowd sensed something was coming and grew even quieter. Natalie walked across the room toward the cart. Several guests exchanged excited looks. Phones appeared in people's hands. Some thought they were witnessing a harmless joke. Others seemed uncertain. I noticed Michael watching from near the stage. His expression darkened immediately. He understood before anyone else did. Natalie returned carrying the bucket. The ballroom fell completely silent. 400 people watched. 400 people waited. And every single one of them believed they already knew how the story would end. The silence lasted only a second after the water hit me, but it felt much longer. Dirty water dripped from my sleeves and onto the marble floor while 400 people stared. Some were smiling. Some looked uncomfortable. Most simply waited to see what would happen next. Natalie stood in front of me holding the empty bucket. Brandon looked proud of himself. Robert folded his arms as though he had just witnessed a long overdue correction. They believed the moment belonged to them. Then I spoke. "Michael," I said calmly, "it is time." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward the stage. Michael Prescott did not move immediately. His expression remained fixed somewhere between disbelief and disappointment. Not because he was surprised by who I was. He already knew that. He was disappointed because he had just watched people destroy themselves without realizing it. Slowly, he stepped away from the stage and walked toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted instinctively. Conversation stopped. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Michael reached us and looked directly at Natalie. He did not appear angry. Somehow that made the moment feel even more serious. Then he turned toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Before we continue tonight's program, there is an important matter that requires clarification." Confused expressions appeared throughout the ballroom. Investors exchanged glances. Department heads leaned toward one another. Members of the board sat upright in their chairs. Natalie frowned. Brandon looked annoyed. Neither of them understood why the chief executive officer was interrupting the evening over what they considered a joke. Michael motioned toward the stage. Two attorneys immediately appeared from a side entrance carrying black portfolios. That was when the atmosphere changed. People stopped seeing entertainment and started seeing procedure. The attorneys placed the portfolios on a table beneath the large projection screen. Michael followed them onto the stage. The room remained silent. "Many people assume they understand how this company operates," he said. "Most know who manages it. Very few know who built it." A ripple moved through the audience. I remained where I was, water still drying on my suit. Michael opened one of the portfolios and removed several documents. The projector screen illuminated behind him. Legal records appeared. Corporate filings. Historical ownership structures. Trust agreements. Names and dates filled the giant screen. Most people looked confused. A few attorneys and board members immediately recognized what they were seeing. Their expressions changed first. Michael continued. 22 years ago, this company began with one warehouse and one founder. As it expanded, ownership was intentionally structured to remain private. The ballroom became so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Natalie stared at the screen. Robert narrowed his eyes. Brandon looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of the attorneys stepped forward and verified the authenticity of the records. Then another. Every document led to the same conclusion. Every structure connected to the same source. Michael paused for a moment before speaking again. "The beneficial owner of Sullivan Global has remained unchanged since its founding." He looked directly toward me. The audience followed his gaze. Hundreds of faces turned in my direction simultaneously. Confusion became uncertainty. Uncertainty became realization. Michael lifted the final document. The projector enlarged a signature that filled the screen behind him. My name appeared across the ballroom in letters large enough for everyone to read. Grant Sullivan. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. Natalie stared at the screen as though it belonged to someone else. Brandon's confidence vanished completely. Robert looked as if he had forgotten how to speak. Across the room, executives who had mocked me only minutes earlier suddenly looked away. The truth had entered the ballroom, and with it came a question nobody wanted to answer. If they had been wrong about me all these years, what else had they been wrong about? The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Nobody in the ballroom seemed certain what to do next. A few minutes earlier, people had been laughing. Now they stared at the projection screen as though it might somehow change if they looked long enough. It did not. My name remained there. The documents remained there. The truth remained there. Michael allowed the room several moments to absorb what they had just learned. Then he continued. There is one additional matter that needs to be addressed. His voice was calm and professional. No anger. No drama. Just facts. That alone made the situation more powerful. Emotional reactions can be dismissed. Facts cannot. The attorneys beside him opened additional folders. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Brandon looked toward Natalie, as if expecting her to explain what was happening. She could not. She was still staring at me. Not with anger anymore. With confusion. Perhaps even regret. Michael looked toward the audience. Over the last 18 months, multiple internal concerns have been documented regarding leadership conduct, policy compliance, promotion recommendations, and operational oversight. The words sounded technical, ordinary, yet several executives immediately understood their significance. Compliance reviews are not casual conversations. They are formal processes. They create records. They create accountability. Most importantly, they create consequences when necessary. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Michael continued. An independent governance review has already been authorized. That statement landed harder than anything else he had said all evening. Brandon's expression changed instantly. Robert looked toward the board members. Claire lowered her eyes. None of them appeared frightened because they had done something dramatic. They appeared frightened because they suddenly realized that years of assumptions were about to meet years of documentation. I remained silent. That surprised many people. They expected revenge. They expected a speech. They expected me to enjoy the moment. Instead, I simply listened. The purpose of truth is not humiliation. Truth does not need help. It stands on its own. Natalie finally stepped toward me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Why did you never tell me? Around us, nobody spoke. For 100 people seemed determined to hear the answer. I looked at her for a moment before responding. I did not hide who I was. The words were gentle, not harsh. You stopped asking. Her eyes filled with emotion. Not because she had discovered I owned the company. Because she had realized something far more painful. She had spent years judging a man she no longer understood. Robert slowly stood from his chair. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Grant, he began. If we have made mistakes, I raised a hand politely. This is not about mistakes. He stopped speaking. I continued. Everyone makes mistakes. The problem begins when people stop questioning their assumptions. The room remained silent. Several employees nodded subtly. They understood exactly what I meant. Michael returned to the stage and concluded the formal presentation. No employment decisions were announced. No dramatic punishments occurred. Real organizations do not operate that way. Reviews would proceed. Documentation would be examined. Policies would be applied equally. Facts would determine outcomes. That was enough. One by one, people began sitting down again. Conversations restarted quietly. The atmosphere had changed completely. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a mirror. Everywhere I looked, people were reconsidering things they had believed only an hour earlier. Natalie remained standing beside me. Brandon said nothing. Robert said nothing. Claire said nothing. For perhaps the first time in years, nobody seemed interested in telling me who they thought I was. And as I looked around the room, I realized the evening was not ending with a revelation. It was ending with something much more powerful. Perspective. Because once people finally see the truth, they can never return to the comfort of their old assumptions. 6 months later, the headlines never came. There were no dramatic news stories. No public scandals. No viral videos. Real life rarely unfolds that way. The governance reviews continued exactly as they were designed to continue. Independent auditors completed their work. Internal committees reviewed documentation. Policies were applied consistently. Some people kept their positions. Others moved on. The process was professional, quiet, and thorough. In the end, Facts spoke louder than emotions ever could. As for me, life became simpler. I spent less time attending formal events and more time doing things I had neglected for years. Long walks near the lake outside Dallas. Early mornings with coffee and a book. Quiet conversations with people who valued honesty more than status. For the first time in a very long time, peace felt natural instead of temporary. One afternoon in early autumn, I received a message from Natalie. She asked if we could meet. After some thought, I agreed. We met at a small lakeside cafe about 40 miles outside the city. The place overlooked calm waters surrounded by trees turning shades of gold and orange. The atmosphere felt peaceful, nothing like the ballroom where everything had changed. Natalie arrived a few minutes early. She looked different, not because of her appearance, because of her expression. The confidence that once demanded attention had softened into reflection. When I sat down across from her, neither of us spoke for a few moments. Finally, she broke the silence. I spent months trying to understand where everything went wrong, she said. I listened. At first I blamed the night itself, she continued. Then I realized the problem started years before that. There was no anger in her voice, no defensiveness, just honesty. The kind that usually arrives after consequences have already done their work. We talked for nearly an hour. About assumptions. About pride. About the danger of believing we know someone without continuing to learn who they are. At one point, she looked at me and asked the question I knew was coming. Can you forgive me? I looked across the lake before answering. The water reflected the afternoon sunlight like polished glass. I already have, I said. Her eyes filled with emotion. Then can we start over? She asked softly. I took a slow breath. Forgiveness and trust are different things. She lowered her eyes. I continued. Forgiveness helps us move beyond the past. Trust builds a future. Sometimes one returns before the other. Sometimes it does not. She nodded slowly. I think she understood before I finished speaking. Some endings are not tragic. They are simply final. We finished our coffee and stood to leave. Before walking away, Natalie thanked me. Not for the meeting, not for the forgiveness, for the truth. Then we headed towards separate cars beneath a sky painted with the colors of a Texas sunset. I never saw her again after that afternoon. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the assumptions, the revelations, the consequences. In the end, the lesson was never about ownership, money, or power. It was about respect. Respect should never depend on a title. It should never depend on status. The way we treat people before we know what they can offer us says far more about our character than anything else. And perhaps that is why the memory of that night no longer feels painful. It feels instructive. The road stretched ahead beneath fading sunlight, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. Before this story ends, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. If you had been standing in my position that night, what would you have done? Would you have walked away, revealed the truth sooner, or handled everything exactly the same way? And if stories about dignity, resilience, respect, and unexpected life lessons resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey. Sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest impact.